Right, I think we should start. So a very warm welcome everyone to this afternoon's Transport Planning Society session on integrated transport. My name is Ben Plowden, I'm chair of the Transport Planning Society, and I'd like to thank Andrew Dowding and the team of Meeting of Minds for letting us use this great space for this afternoon's session. Just in case you don't know about the Transport Planning Society, we're a professional body representing transport planners, as its name suggests. We support their professional development through our training and skills programme, and we work to influence decision-making on both transport policy and practice in order to try and bring about a more sustainable transport system, both nationally but also, obviously, today managed to regionally and locally as well. Just a quick bit of audience research. Put up your hands if you are a paid-up member of the Transport Planning Society. Put up your hand if you're not, if now feeling a bit sheepish about being in the room. And put up your hand if you have no idea what I'm talking about and you think you should be in an aeronautical conference. Oh, good, just checking. So I went back this morning to look at John Prescott's, the late lamented John Prescott's Integrated Transport White Paper, A New Deal for Transport Better for Everyone. 1998, hands up if you were working when he brought it out. Great, some people are old enough to remember that. And it's fascinating if you go back and look at that document because so much of the reason for him producing that document still applies today. So John Prescott's foreword said that the White Paper fulfilled the government's manifesto commitment to create a better, more integrated transport system to tackle the problems of congestion and pollution we have inherited. It is timely because the previous government recognised that we could not go on as before, building more and more new roads to accommodate the growth in traffic, with our new obligations to meet targets on climate change. 1998, the need for a new approach is urgent. Well, if it was urgent in 1998, I think you'll agree that it's much more urgent now. You only have to look at the terrible footage of the fires in LA, the floods in Valencia, but closer to home, the data from Transport for the North suggesting that a third of the population of that region suffer from transport-related social exclusion. So we urgently need to bring about a more integrated, more sustainable transport system in the way that we did a generation ago. And it's very interesting that when Louise Haigh launched the consultation on the new government's integrated national transport strategy, she said in a very similar vein, I'm launching a new national vision of transport that seamlessly joins all the modes of transport together and puts people at the heart of the transport system. So the question before us this afternoon is, how integrated could the integrated national transport strategy be? Will it focus on kind of intermodal integration so that our buses and our trains and our trams and our walking and our cycling and our taxis all planned and operate together in a more coordinated way? Or could we, if we thought about it, integrate transport better with spatial planning, where the 1.5 new million homes are going to go, the new towns that the government wants to build, the new economic development the government wants to unlock through the changes to the planning system? Could we integrate it better in terms of the relationships between different tiers of government in what I think is an increasingly kind of complex institutional landscape for transport planning delivery? Could we integrate it with clever ways of funding and financing new transport investment and transport infrastructure? And how are we going to integrate across the different modes, given the multiple different agencies involved in planning, operating and investing in those modes? So to help us answer those questions, we've got some fantastic speakers. On my right, we have Anna Hart, who's a Senior Finance Manager in Transport for London, who leads on TfL's work around novel funding and financing of transport projects. Next to her is Nicola Kane, who's a director at Steer here in Manchester, but previously worked for Transport for Greater Manchester in a strategic director role. To my left is Martin Gilmour, who's Deputy Director of Planning in the DfT, responsible for thinking about how you integrate transport planning with spatial planning. And on his left is Naomi, who's the MD of England's economic Heartland, who spends a lot of time, I think we're going to hear, thinking about how you integrate decision-making, funding, planning between the different tiers of government involved in this system. So what I'm going to ask the speakers to do is just spend 4 or 5 minutes, 5 or 6 minutes, just introducing an element of the integration question. Then I'll ask a couple of questions from here, and then we'll throw the conversation open to all of you for questions, comments, observations you might want to make about what you've heard or what you think we should get from the integrated transport strategy. So I'm going to start with Martin, because in my mind, the kind of foundational requirement is to integrate transport planning infrastructure better with spatial planning and other forms of physical development to make sure that we get the right development in the right locations so that people can have the benefits of those developments in a way that doesn't necessarily require them to own and use a household car full time. Martin.
Hello everyone, and thank you Ben and to TPS for organising this session and inviting me onto the panel. And as Ben kindly introduced, I'm Martin Gilmour. I'm a transport planner and a civil servant and an ex-board member of the Transport Planning Society and Deputy Director for Planning and Transport at DfT. And I often joke, at least in a job title, shows that the department is serious about integrating planning and transport. And so, as Ben talked, I'm briefly going to talk about the work the department is doing to integrate transport and spatial planning, some of those wider planning reforms, and how the target to build 1.5 million homes fits into that. So I think starting with the latter, I think it's fair to say, as a country, we haven't been great at integrating transport and housing to date, despite good intentions of the planning system and warm words in policy. Something isn't working on the ground for how we do that. I'm also well aware of the risk of having a very ambitious target for housing, 1.5 million homes, that when you're focused on a target and delivering it quickly within a parliament, it's very easy to think that, well, actually, second-hand considerations like transport, like the location of housing, there's a risk that that becomes a second-hand consideration when you're focused on a target. So what I wanted to try and do is try and reassure why I'm confident that that risk is being mitigated and won't happen, and the kind of things we're doing in place in the Integrated National Transport Strategy and our wider reforms to try and prevent that from happening. So I think firstly, I'll talk about the changes to the NPPF. A lot of you will know that we, in the way that transport is assessed in local plans and in decision making, we changed that approach in the NPPF following a consultation last year to be more vision-led. There is guidance to follow very soon on how we see that being implemented. But in a nutshell, we feel for too long that transport has been based on, what has happened in the past, what do we think will happen in the future, and how do we cater and provide for that, the predict and provide model. And we've spent less time describing and working with stakeholders on the kind of places that we want people to live in, what we want them to look like, and backcasting from that to how we want them to be, in particular, well-connected and sustainable. So the premise and the intention behind that change to vision-led is the first step to taking a much more outcome-based approach to how we plan our housing and our transport. And it's very much intended that it will help with the integration of those two things. So I think that's a first really important step in what we're doing. And updated TA guidance, which I know has been promised as part of the government response to that, is coming very shortly. So I hope to be able to publish that soon. I think the second thing that I'd like to talk about, and again, it's a soon-to-be-launched tool, and some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but is the DfT's connectivity tool. So for those who aren't aware of this is a brand new model that the DfT has built, which has divided England and Wales into 100 by 100 metre grids and given a score of how connected each of those grids is by public transport, walking and cycling to everyday facilities, healthcare, schools, jobs, education. It's essentially, you might argue, the closest thing to a national PTAL at TfL, but it is different because this is both a land use and a transport tool, not just a public transport model. So we're hoping, working with MHCLG, that we can embed that in decision making. So when you're making a decision about a site allocation or whether a site is suitable for development, a quantitative national score could help inform that decision. Or it could help inform decisions about density or whatever it might be, but it would standardise the definition of sustainable development or help at least create a level playing field between different areas. It would also enable you to put in different interventions like a new bus line or a new tram route or something, and that would tell you what that would do to the score. So I think that's a really important part of the puzzle and what we're doing. And then finally, the Integrated National Transport Strategy being led by Danny Williams. Obviously, there's a number of roadshows going on. I think the team are at Euston today. There's been for a call for ideas. But to echo what Ben said, I know the team and the ministerial team in particular are very focused that this isn't just about integration between modes of transport, as important as that is, and there's a lot to be done on integrated ticketing and making that simpler, but very much how it integrates with wider land use and spatial planning. It's not easy to do, it's easy to say in a policy document, but how do you change the cultures and make sure it actually happens at all levels is something that we need to hopefully discuss today and work through. But there's a little bit of context of some of the work the department's doing.
Brilliant, Martin. Thank you very much. So, obviously, the vision-led approach rather than predict and provide, flowing down through guidance and the connectivity tool into sort of day-to-day decisions in local government in particular. You talked about sort of place-based and outcome-based approach rather than a kind of casting forward from where we are now. What might be an example of the sort of outcome that you might be expecting to sort of outline and aim for if you're thinking about sort of a new development? What sort of things would you be interested in?
I think every site is going to be different, but I think if a development comes forward and it's in a well-connected place and a developer may say, look, we really think this development could achieve a high modal share, we'd want, X percentage of trips to be internalised, we want 50% of trips to be walking and cycling, rather than modelling and trying to disprove that is possible, I see very much going, okay, let's work backwards how that might be achieved. I think it's very easy to say, oh, that's just not realistic or that's not possible, without really thinking about how the policy decisions of the past have influenced those existing conditions that you're predicting happen in the future. So it's not about the DFT saying every place should look like this or every place needs to be like this. It's just making sure that the assessment is done differently and we take a different approach to it. Because to be honest, we've been doing it one way now for the best part of half a century, and it isn't working other than with the odd exception. So I think we should try something different and see if we can do this.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you very much. We'll come back to Martin in a minute. Naomi, you're sort of right in the middle of the question around the relationships between national, subnational, regional, local government decision-making, obviously all the partners that operate those levels, and there's kind of money and ideas flowing, in many directions through that system. Give us your sort of sense of how we might integrate those tiers of decision-making, particularly the government committed to more devolution, better or well, so that we get the best outcomes and decisions made at the right level.
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Ben. And first of all, Martin, it was great to hear all of that. And actually, for those of us who've been working in this arena of transport to support growth for some time, you cannot argue with all of the things that Martin's just said. It's fantastic, and really grateful to you for all of the kind of leadership you're taking forward within the department. What was interesting for me as a subnational transport body working, England's Economic Heartland covers the geography from Oxford to Cambridge and then beyond to Swindon and through Northamptonshire to Hertfordshire. So we cover what is now referred to as the Oxford-Cambridge Growth Corridor as well, which is a really key interest to Treasury. And I think what's been interesting from a integrated national transport strategy is when Louise Haigh launched the strategy, her focus was quite frequently on sort of the impact of for people on being able to access transport. So different types of people being able to access the transport that they needed to access. It was quite I felt that was her focus, was very much about the people. And then when you hear Martin and perhaps where Heidi Alexander's taking this, there is a much more of a policy spectrum as well. How do the policies work together? But actually, to truly achieve this, my challenge would be that you need to go a step further into the systems of integration and how systems of decision-making can change fundamentally to get the outcomes for the transport network that we require. And that is about giving people better access and transport-related social exclusion and dealing with those issues, unlocking growth, etc. So just to give you an example, in our region, which is actually quite a strategic example, we've been for a long time focusing on the need for investment in rail improvements at Ely Junction, a very small bit of the railway that unlocks an enormous opportunity. Investing in that railway solution would take 96,000 lorries off the road every year. The cost benefit for that scheme is in excess of 4.5 to 1. To us, it feels like a no-brainer. It is a rail solution to a road-based problem. But when you go into the Department for Transport to have that conversation, Are we talking to the roads people or are we talking to the rail people? Because the benefits are quite disaggregated between those two modes. So the system needs to change, and that's quite a big strategic freight type example. But actually across the board, when we're thinking about how you decarbonise the transport system, actually the solution as much lies within kind of power supply and all of those things that are way outside the Department for Transport's remit, and bringing all of those different systems together is a huge task and a huge challenge. And the truth is you need all of it to make it work, which is where, as Ben said, those different layers of governance need to come in together. And it's actually not a nice to have. Like this is not just a great idea. This is a reality. And one of the pieces of work that we've seen recently coming out around East West Rail is that around 374,000 homes will be within 10 minutes of an East West Rail station. But actually, if you put good door-to-door planning, good transport integration in, you unlock about double that again. And that's not just a nice to have. That is massive for the fare box. It's massive for the business case for the scheme. And it's actually massive for the potential for our region to return economic growth to the UK economy. So those kind of integration stories are not just about, oh, isn't this a lovely thing to do? It is a reality of how we look at transport planning in the future. And of course, as Ben said, in other parts of the country, there will be much deeper stories about kind of transport-related social exclusion as well. But actually, fundamentally, devolution is a critical part of the story. The more that you devolve funding and create single integrated transport pots, the easier it is to break down those systems and those barriers within the system. But in reality, in different places, devolution is a little bit more challenging to have if you don't have an obvious dominant metropolitan area which you can design a single transport system for. If you look at my region, across between Oxford and Cambridge, we've got big historic cities, but actually a lot of our economic growth is in smaller polycentric economies. And to connect those places together cannot be achieved within a single mayoral geography as we might see them. It's about all of those different areas working together, which is where a sub-national level needs to come in. But if you just did the mayoral level and the sub-national level, what you would be missing is the big national thinking about the strategic freight networks, the strategic rail networks, the strategic road networks, and that's where we need to work with the national level to bring that in as well.
Naomi, thank you very much. So the subnational transport bodies, of which you are the MD of one of them, obviously sit in this complex system. What changes to what you are either permitted or required to do would be helpful to help you kind of navigate and convene and corral in that system? What would be really helpful for you?
Well, I mean, one of the big ones is actually being able to work with the other government departments and have the traction in the departments that, at the moment, perhaps we have a huge amount of traction within the Department for Transport and in elements of MHCLG. But actually, when you start getting into the departments for looking at energy or digital connectivity, it is much harder for us to do that. But at a sub-regional level, that, again, it still won't be achievable at just mayoral level. It needs to be all of those departments seeing that sub-regional level, bringing all of those different strands together.
Brilliant. Great, thank you. Anna, so TfL is, I think, is well known for having found innovative ways of raising money from a variety of new sources to pay for both infrastructure improvements but also for day-to-day operations. So give us a sense from your point of view about how we could integrate those decisions and that planning better into our sort of long-term transport planning. What do we need to do elsewhere to sort of to follow TfL's lead?
Yes, so I guess the first thing would be to say a few words about TfL itself, and then also to reflect on what happens when financial planning is well integrated and what happens when it's not well integrated. And I think TfL has got experience in both of those areas.
Where are you now? Good or bad?
We are on the cusp of a transition, I think. So, yes, as most people probably know, Transport for London is an integrated public transport authority looking after operations and management of London's public transport network. We are an executive body of the Greater London Authority, and we respond to the Mayor of London. TfL was created in 2000, and at the moment we are a £10 billion per annum business, and we spend around 70% of that on operating the day-to-day network, and then 30% on investments, renewals, and enhancement projects. And I guess as TfL approaches its 25th anniversary, quite a milestone, we've got a sort of a quarter of a century worth of experience on financial planning. And if we reflect back on how that has developed, I think the first years up until 2013 were quite a stable funding environment for TfL. We had multi-year funding deals agreed with the Department for Transport, which enabled TfL to plan for the long term. Then from around 2013, we saw the operating grants cut, and the remainder of the grants gradually being phased out and replaced by an alternative funding stream that the Mayor of London controlled. And then, of course, we had COVID-19, and in March 2020, we saw TfL's fares revenue drop by 90% overnight. So that was a really difficult period in organizational history from the point of view of financial stability and sustainability. So in 2020, we entered that tricky period of needing to go back to the Department for Transport to seek extraordinary or emergency funding agreements to simply make sure that we can keep the lights on and keep the show on the road, so to speak. And we were grateful that we were able to secure around £6 billion through those emergency deals. However, they were very short term and didn't provide that funding certainty in the long term, which essentially meant we had to cut our investment program and put a stop to a number of renewals and investments that we were planning to do. And I think reflecting back on that period, even 4 or 5 years since then, London is still feeling the effect of those reductions in the level of capital expenditure. So, for example, last year we've had problems on the Central Line, which were well documented, and that can be traced back to the fact that our maintenance budget for that line was reduced during the COVID period. And similarly, we're not able to replace Bakerloo Line trains, which is the oldest rolling stock in the country, and it's not the way in which an integrated public transport authority should ideally operate. And I think this is something that our Commissioner Andy Lord reflected on when he spoke with the Financial Times last week. The aspiration at the moment is that we would be able to secure a longer time or longer term funding agreements with the department through the comprehensive spending review, and we'll find out the outcome of that later in the year. And I guess if we think about the ultimate prize of integrated financial planning within the public transport system, it would be that we would simply be able to deliver the public transport investment that the country needs. I think if we treat public transport as essentially the catalyst to economic development, to increased productivity and housing delivery, then you can kind of put investment question into the wider economic perspective. And I think there's plenty of evidence that actually investment in public transport does lead to greater economic benefits. We had a report published by Hatch, professional services firm, last year, look at the sort of how TfL's expenditure with our supply chain feeds into the greater value add in the rest of the economy. And that report found that TfL's £12 billion spent in the past 2 years supported 100,000 jobs per year across the UK, so not just in London, and also generated £11 billion in gross value add for the wider economy. So the size of the prize is quite sizable, and I guess the kind of the main takeaways that I would like to leave you with is how do we do financial planning well? Well, firstly, we need to have long-term plans for public transport investment. We then need to overlay the financial plans on top of that, recognizing that ways to pay for operating a network might be different to ways to pay for the capital expenditure. And then finally, we need to answer the tricky question of how do we divide that cost across the different levels of government and with the public transport authorities? Because I think it would be unrealistic to expect central governments to fund the entire cost of public transport investment in the country. So what would be a kind of a fair and equitable way to split that cost would be one of the key questions that I think we would like the Integrated National Transport Strategy to look at as well.
Brilliant. So I know when I was at Transport for London, which I was for a while, I remember having conversations quite regularly about the fact that I think from memory, something like 70% of TfL's customers don't actually pay TfL a fare because they, apart from the congestion charge, they turn up and use the road network for free at the point of use. How do you decide whether and how, to what extent to invest in measures that don't necessarily, at least directly, generate revenue for TfL, and compare that, for example, against the Elizabeth line where you're going to get a big bump in fare revenue? When you're investing on behalf of people who don't pay you any money to use your services, how do you kind of decide where to rank those investments compared to fare-paying investments?
Yes, and this is a really tricky area because, of course, if we think about the larger projects like the Elizabeth line, like the DLR extension to Thamesmead that we're working on at the moment, of course, they unlock a significant amount of new development, both residential and commercial, and that development can then be used to part fund that investment through mechanisms like the community infrastructure levy, variations on the business rates system. So it is almost easier to make a decision to make investment into enhancement projects because actually we can get money back from them. But it's important not to forget the need to ensure that what we've got already, so the existing network, needs to be maintained and sufficient level of funding directed toward it to make sure that we are, the best that we can be. And there is a trade-off, but I think it's important to make sure that there is a balance being struck between the two.
Great. Thank you very much. So Nicola, lastly, but definitely not leastly, so I raised a question at the start about, how much broader could the transport strategy be in what ways could it be integrated more broadly? But clearly, it's critically important that we end up with a system which is integrated in this traditional sense that your buses and your trains and your taxis and your walking and your cycling all kind of work together, they're planned together, they're invested together, they're operated together. From your experience, both working for a city authority but also now in consulting, how are we going to do that and how are we going to make the customer experience properly seamless, whether it's in terms of ticketing, information, services arriving at the right time? How's that going to work and what does the transport strategy need to do to help that happen?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And it's really good to be having this conversation in Manchester today. We were talking at lunchtime about what's the importance of a transport strategy. Do we really need transport strategy? But I think kind of looking around Manchester now, see yellow buses on our streets and thinking that actually those of us who worked on kind of developing the last transport strategy for Greater Manchester, we did have a role to play in setting out a kind of compelling vision of what an integrated transport system could be. There's a long way to go to deliver that, but actually having that strategy in place was hugely important and making the case for franchising, getting that over the line, how we're going to roll out walking and cycling routes across the whole of Greater Manchester and having a very vision-led, place-based approach to that. So I think hopefully that what you can see on the streets now here is testament to the importance of good transport planning and good strategy development. So as a transport planner, I guess I put myself in the shoes of the people who've been tasked with writing the National Transport Strategy, thinking about how I would go about it. And people who know me know I don't tend to start from a modal perspective. And I hope that that's one of the outcomes of this new transport strategy, that actually we have a really compelling vision of what we want transport to deliver and the wider outcomes it can deliver. And I think it's great to hear from the DfT today that that's very much in their minds. We've got a mission-led government. That's great. I'd love to see those missions, not just the growth mission, but all of the missions kind of translated into what does that mean for transport and how can transport enable in the widest sense a more productive economy, a more inclusive economy, delivery of net zero, all of those things. I think there's an opportunity now to kind of translate what that means, both at a national network level, but also at a local level. So I'm excited to see that sort of take shape, and I hope that vision-led approach very much kind of permeates the new transport strategy. And then it would be nice to see that kind of quantified, because I think, again, we were talking earlier, an earlier conversation today about how we used to have kind of national indicators, the local transport plans you felt like you were contributing to a kind of wider set of objectives. We haven't had that for quite a long time, I don't think, from central government. The feeling that we're all kind of pulling together, whether you work for national highways, whether you work for Network Rail, whether you're a bus operator, whether you're working in a local authority, that we're all kind of pulling in the same direction. And I think some quantified elements of that vision will be very helpful to say this is what we're trying to achieve around net zero, around vision zero and road safety, around the economy. So that's kind of where I would start, not from a modal perspective, but from a vision-led perspective. And then I think, and this is something that I think we did quite well in Greater Manchester, is think about the huge variety of trips that are being made, both for people and the sorts of different freight movements that we need our transport system to facilitate. So really sort of thinking about from a very strategic perspective, how people access our ports and airports, how they travel between towns and cities, right down to those very short local neighbourhood trips. We need to be able to better articulate what that range of movements are that the national transport strategy is going to be kind of overseeing. And then how do you do that in a kind of seamless way? What different modes do you need to facilitate different sorts of travel? So I know in the past we've used kind of modal hierarchies. I'm not a massive fan of that because it feels like a very blunt instrument when you are trying to cater for very different sorts of movements. So at a very local level that might work, but obviously some trips are better suited to different modes. So it'd be nice to kind of see something like that, but applied in a much more nuanced way for the different sorts of trips that we're trying to facilitate. And then thinking if one of our objectives is to provide a system which means you don't have to own a car or you don't need to use a car for every trip, we need to be thinking very carefully about what are all the pain points on those journeys, because if you're getting public transport, you're going to be at least walking to a stop and so on. And how do we work through each of those pain points by creating a system that is better integrated physically through joined up infrastructure, through joined up services, has a more joined up set of information systems. I know this is like the holy grail that we've always talked about, but I think, again, the new strategy can really set out a vision for what that should be. More integrated fares and ticketing. And I think going back to some of the behaviour change programmes that we've seen in the past that seem to have gone right off the agenda, how can we really sell an alternative view of a really well-functioning public transport system, active travel to the public in a way that we haven't really focused on for a long time. So I don't know if that answers your question fully, Ben, but that's kind of how I would go about it and think about the reality of all the different sorts of movements that our transport system has to cater for, and how can we all work together as an industry to realise that vision.
Great. So we know, don't we, that 70% of trips in the country are still 5 miles or less. So most travel in the country is still local, roughly speaking.
Yeah.
Naomi's touched on the whole question around sort of thinking about the decision-making process and systems that we use. To what extent do you think the Integrated National Transport Strategy is actually going to be enacted regionally and locally and subnationally rather than by people sitting in Westminster and Whitehall, no disrespect, Martin, but in terms, because most of the activity is actually at least within the city regions. To what extent does it need to be sort of devolved, do you think?
Absolutely, yeah. I didn't touch on that because I think having done all that, thinking about the variety of trips you're catering for, then allocating the resources in a way that kind of that actually relates to that level of activity is really, really important. There are some really huge infrastructure projects that obviously need to be invested in. But as you say, the vast majority of trips are very, very local. And the more you can invest in that local transport system, the better the outcomes overall, I think. There's definitely a tension, I think, between the kind of planning approaches, I think, that are used by kind of national agencies and the sort of, I think, the more vision-led approach, which is starting to be kind of really embedded in local transport plans. And it would be nice if this new national transport strategy could provide a clearer sense of direction, so we all feel we're pulling in the same direction. Because ultimately, even long distance trips they'll all start and finish in a local place. So we need to make sure we're thinking about that end-to-end journey.
Okay. So we've heard really interesting themes around systems of decision making, allocation of resources, decisions about what to prioritise, focus on outcomes. I'm interested to understand from each of you, integration is something that's very easy to talk about in theory. I think, Martin, you said this. And the reality is it's actually quite hard to do in practice for a whole set of reasons to do with human psychology, institutional design, small and big P politics. I'm interested to understand, even if we had a great integrated national transport strategy on paper, how easy it will actually be from where you sit to achieve integration in practice in the systems that we all use. Naomi, perhaps starting with you, because you talked about the importance of decision-making systems. When it comes to it, once we have the strategy and it's a document and there's a set of intentions and aspirations, how easy is it going to be to actually do integration in real life, do you think?
So as we were listening to everyone's kind of reflections, I did sit here thinking, God, this is exhausting. This is so hard. And I think we've got to collectively recognise that we all have a responsibility to help the department get there, because alone it is as you say, a strategy cannot do this. It can set the framework, but actually, what is it that you do the day after it's published to start moving on that journey? And collectively, we need to look at what those things are, because within local authorities, as you say, you can see, Manchester is an incredible example of how you can arrive in a city and go, well, this is okay, I can do this, I can make this work. But even in my own region, when I got off a station, bearing in mind it's my sort of job, I got to the station and had no option. And yet, and that's no one's fault, that's just the system. How do we, on day one, make those things? And there are probably, I think, some quick wins, which I'm afraid probably is near bus rail integration and those simple things that stop it being so hard to actually make those first choices. And then in time, the bigger things have to happen. But I think collectively, there's a capacity, a capability, and a cultural thing within the sector that says, right, on day one, what are we going to do differently? And we all have to lean in. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And then we all have to go and see Martin. And we have to say, right, Department for Education, they are not playing ball in this, and they are putting schools, making policy decisions that don't help, and Department for Health are making it difficult, and all these things. And then we can tell Martin all our problems, and then hopefully, actually, in all seriousness, through devolution, those conversations with the other government departments are a lot easier. But I think we have to lean in.
Brilliant. So, Martin, you sit in this leaning in process at the kind of intersection between at least two sets of relationships. One is with your colleagues in other departments, at the interface between transport planning and land use planning, but also between national government and local authority planners. How easy, in your experience, is it to actually, the thing we need to lean into, how easy is that to do in practice, in your experience? How could we do it better?
Not easy, and I've worked in a local authority, I've worked at TfL and now national government, so I feel I have a good sense of the scales and how they filter down, and under no illusion how deeply entrenched the way that we currently work in this sector really is, so it's not going to happen. overnight. I think your points were completely right, that we have to step by step and go through it. But I know even within transport, we've made these changes in the MPPF, but I still know National Highways will object on a highway capacity grounds or something tomorrow in their regional teams, and a transport consultant will work with a client who wants the path of least resistance, so we'll go for the big highway engineering scheme and things. And it's all these micro decisions that are happening on a day-by-day basis that is the difficult challenge. So I totally see that it's a whole sector approach. We can put the policy foundations in place, we can produce the guidance, we can go out there and do teach-ins and roadshows and try and say, we're taking a different approach, but unless the whole sector is behind us and operating in the same direction, we're not going to make it work, and we'll still be sitting here on this panel in 10 years' time, talking
25 years time,
or 25 taking the same problems. So.
Brilliant. Okay. So Anna, some might argue that London, partly because of the way it's set up in the statute, partly because of the way that TfL and the GLA have evolved over the last 25 years, are not bad at integrating, whether it's generally modally or specifically in your area, sort of financial planning. How easy do you think it is to replicate that in other parts of the system? And what would your advice be to colleagues thinking about, to Naomi's point, how exhausting this could be?
Yeah. Look, I think funding discussions and conversations are never easy. There is never enough funding to go around every project that wants to be done. So it's a challenging space, and I think I've mentioned earlier, we can't expect central government to kind of shoulder the entire cost of public transport needs of the country. So I think what may be helpful is to reflect on what local authorities and local government can raise at a local level, and almost have a list of funding streams that are available and can be tapped. Even with the currently available funding streams, there will still be a gap. So there may be a need for some uncomfortable conversations around approaches such as land value capture, land value sharing, thinking about the idea that all beneficiaries of public transport investment should be making an equitable contribution to that infrastructure. This is probably an area where other countries may be a little bit more advanced than the UK, but that's got a lot to do with the cultural kind of history and the political context as well. But I think starting these uncomfortable conversations on how do we attract more funding into the public transport space can go a long way. And I think that applies to both sort of London region and also other parts of the country.
Brilliant. So Nicola, coming to you last then. So in terms of how easy is it going to be, and what could we do to make it easier for all the protagonists in the system to actually integrate across these different dimensions of the decision making we need to do?
Yeah, I mean, none of this is easy. Otherwise we would have cracked it by now, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
But I do think we've been operating kind of in different systems, thinking about things in different ways at different levels of government. So I think I feel quite optimistic, actually, that we've got a chance now of having a planning system and a transport system that starts to pull together that clarity of direction from central government, perhaps new forms of devolution, more local political accountability, which I think does make a massive difference in terms of this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to be, you hold me accountable for that, because I think we haven't had that. And I think if there is more kind of public direction, public control, then we can start to sort of make sure the transport system's delivering the outcomes we need. But it's going to take some time and effort. But if we've got that clarity of vision, we've got a better chance of getting there.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much. Right, so over to the audience now. So comments, questions. If you'd like to say something or ask a question, please give us your name. If you have an affiliation, tell us what that is. And if a question is for a particular member of the panel, then say who that is. Otherwise, I'll I'll parse the questions appropriately. So who'd like to raise a question? Gentleman here. I think we might have a mic actually on, so yeah. Thank you.
John Carr, speaking for the Association of Transport Coordinators.
Wait, you're about to be mic'd.
Hello.
Say that again?
We'll go again.
More promising.
Hello.
Right. Okay. So start again, John.
Right. John Carr, speaking for the Association of Transport Coordinating Officers. And I hate to think how many times in 40-odd years in transport planning I've heard sections of this debate repeated. Now, it seems to me that when we talk of an integrated national transport strategy, we are saying that when we've got a set of STB strategies, which look pretty good on the whole, we've got, sitting below that, at least some of our local authorities, decent transport plans and policies in place and decent integration of bus and rail. And it's not only in London and Manchester that it happens. Most of the big cities have got at least some coordination between bus and train, whether with timetables and in some cases with fares as well. But one of the things that I'm surprised hasn't come out is evaluation. You know, we abuse cost-benefit analysis, and I say abuse advisedly, to evaluate all schemes from large to small, and patently small time savings are not the way that you evaluate and prove the case for a bus lane, for example. And I was looking through some papers of the small consultancy that I joined when I left West Yorkshire. And in 2006 or so, I think it was, there was an evaluation of a dial-a-ride service to what was previously the shot and steel works that British Steel had closed. And the dial-a-ride service was intended to bring people from what we in those days referred to as the journey to work area. And because it was run by Flintshire County Council and because they'd used their one-stop shop as the booking line for it, the people that did the evaluation were able to go back and look at something like 300 people that had used the service. Amongst them, they majored in the report on 3 who had been previously unemployed for 10 years, costing approximately 7k a year each. And if we had been able to use cross-sector pricing, you would have got 21k back against a service which, from recollection, was only costing about 42k anyway. Now, if you go on and say, well, and I can't say why this wasn't done by my colleagues, if you go on and look at environmental...
So John, what's the question?
Go and look, the environmental benefits, then you could well have shown that that was now a commercial service. Now, my question is there any chance of convincing the Treasury to look at outcome-based evaluation and wean it off the determination that all transport projects should be evaluated by the Green Book?
Right, Martin, big question for you. You need to be careful how you answer this question, I'm sure. But again, Naomi touched on, we all have to some extent, that, how we make these decisions, what data we use, what evaluation techniques we use. You've talked about the connectivity tool. To what extent do you think there's room in here to change the way we actually make decisions? You mentioned transport outcomes rather than...
Yeah. I mean, definitely. And as a transport planner, I agree the way that we assess the benefits of our schemes is outdated and wrong. As a government official and a civil servant, I know, just for an example, we're going through a very comprehensive spending review process. To give you some comfort, every bid has to show how it delivers on the government missions of growth, on housing, on clean energy. So there's much more of those missions are outcome-based. Our spending review bids have to show how they deliver on those missions, and that doesn't just come down to a BCR and a CBA. So there is a change of tone, at least, in that. So I'm confident there is at least a recognition that the way we are assessing our schemes and the benefits of them is not bringing the best value for money for the taxpayer, and there's a recognition that we need to change that.
Great.
So, yeah.
And then I guess the same question for you. You've talked about sort of, competing priorities and never enough money to go around, even with things like SIL. How do you think we can take adequate account of these kind of broader outcomes that we might be actually trying to achieve from transport investment, as opposed to kind of narrower time savings or something? How do you do that in London?
Yeah, it's looking at the wider picture, isn't it? Are we supporting housing delivery? Are we increasing productivity as a result of a particular scheme? Are we improving environmental outcomes as a result of that? It's sort of needing to look at the holistic picture, and journey time savings is definitely not the only thing that we need to consider. And we've again tried in London to look at the wider benefits as well, but it all ties in to the information that the departments would like to see. But I think we are on the same page in terms of how to present the benefits of schemes.
And to what extent does the system, the Treasury rules, the business case models allow you to do that, or would it be helpful? To what extent would it be helpful if the kind of decision-making rules were changed a bit to make that easier?
I think it would be helpful if there were a little bit more flexibility and more change. So I've mentioned the land value capture, land value sharing approaches. Now, that is an area that we are finding somewhat tricky to feed in explicitly into any sort of appraisal metrics, because beneficiary analysis, equity map analysis sit outside of that. I think the debate and the conversation on land value capture within the government is taking centre stage. So MHTLG has launched an inquiry into land value capture, and TfL was very eager to put forward a response on that. So I think, as Martin is saying, the mood is changing, the conversation is changing and expanding to take account of these wider points as well.
Right. Yeah, Nicola, your experience, how easy do the evaluation decision-making rules make it to get the right outcomes in terms of investment?
I do think it's really difficult, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens as mayoral combined authorities move towards more integrated settlements. They're not going to have complete freedom, my understanding, to sort of move things around as they like, but as you have mayors who are responsible for delivering a wide range of outcomes and more freedom to sort of direct funding in different ways to achieve those outcomes, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how they do that in a way to perhaps use transport funding to deliver health outcomes or environmental outcomes or whatever it may be. So I think that it's a sort of challenge and an opportunity I can see that MCAs are going to have to really face up to over the coming months and years.
Brilliant. And Naomi, I mentioned Martin Tugwell's research on transport-related social exclusion in the north, which is kind of overtly linking transport to wider goals around poverty alleviation. To what extent are you able to sort of make those outcome-based arguments, both in terms of formal evaluations, but also just in terms of making the case for investment in your area?
Well, I mean, when I was listening to your question and comment, I actually again thought it's about the responsibility on all of us to have the evidence to then make those bolder decisions. So TfL do really excellent evaluation of their investments. The Elizabeth Line kind of benefits realisation work is really, really good. If you go beyond that, it's quite hard to find it. So therefore, I think the Borders Railway has done some really good work as well. So therefore, how do you start to build a case that can justify Treasury making difficult decisions if collectively we aren't holding as much of the evidence of the benefits realisation as we could do? And so just to build on that, in the case of the Oxford to Cambridge geography, East West Rail is a huge investment by the government, and Department for Transport officials said to us as the sub-national transport body, right, you're behind this scheme. A lot of these benefits aren't transport benefits. What are you going to do to help us realise these benefits, because we are leaning in here. We're going to invest in, well, we with Treasury are going to keep going on investing in this scheme, but what are you going to do? You're telling us it's going to return all of these benefits. What are you going to do to help us? So we've done a huge amount of work to build a kind of broader narrative and broader programme to leverage the wider outcomes of a scheme like East West Rail around digital connectivity, around a green corridor, biodiversity net gain, some of the tourism work that can happen from that. All of those things have to be realised by people putting the time and effort in, A, to make it happen, and B, to report on it. And until we do those things, it's really hard to say to the government, right, just go on faith, we believe this.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, gentleman here, and then gentleman at the back.
Richard Mann from Midlands Connect. My question is, setting vision is great, but in the kind of practical life of a strategy, maybe 5 years, what would you see as kind of the principal things that might change as a result of this strategy? What should we be focusing in on in terms of delivery and a kind of sensible timescale for delivery, rather than just setting the kind of end vision?
Okay, so great question. So yeah, we're going to have vision-led planning, but what would, Martin, from your point of view, what we need to have seen happen differently as a result of the strategy to demonstrate that it was a useful thing to do?
That's a tricky one, because by their very definition, visions are long term.
Yeah, sure.
You know, but I do accept there are shorter term funding decisions and decisions that have to be taken on more immediate priorities. I still think having a long-term vision or a long-term plan that you can still check alignment of those short-term decisions against is a helpful tool. Now, it may be for a number of reasons that you have to take a decision to address an immediate concern that doesn't quite align to the vision, but at least the check and balance of going through that process and being able to justify why you can't is helpful. But yeah, I don't think there's any way of getting away with this. There's going to be some short-term thinking and short-term decisions, but I would still always advocate that having a longer-term vision, that yes, you can iterate through monitoring and checking if things are working, doing regular pulse and sense checks with your stakeholders about whether things are working are helpful, so you can iterate and be agile and flexible. But yeah, having that longer-term target to check and balance against, I think, is still important.
Great. Naomi, you talked about the importance of everyone leaning in, you know, once the strategy's out, to do some stuff quickly. What do you think would need to be done to show that this made a difference in terms of people's, you know, daily lives?
So in the kind of short time horizon that you talk about, I've talked a lot about systems thinking, and now I'm going to go really not down that route. I absolutely think it has to be around integration of public transport with active travel and getting that right outside of the cities. It's really, really hard to do, and I absolutely think we have to do that. And secondly, perhaps this is a bit, given the geography of where we are, actually seeing some places evolving that have this built in from the beginning. You know, we've got new stations on East West Rail. Please, can we design them properly with kind of connections to the wider community from that? I think those are two things that we can't wait. Brilliant.
Anna, in London, the mayor has a legal duty to produce a transport strategy, which has a kind of 20 to 30 year time horizon, and then everything else follows on from that, the business planning process, the budget. What do you think will need to be different outside London to show that it was useful having an integrated national transport strategy?
Yeah. Look, I guess in London, we've sort of been operating on a yearly business plans with very short-term funding settlements. So 5 years feels like a really long time. And I guess you can do quite a lot in 5 years from the financial point of view. You know, you can lay down the foundations of fiscal devolution, of wider financial power devolution to the regions. You can lay down principles of land value capture, land value sharing, introduction of any new taxes, which take a long time to implement. So putting the foundations in now and tying that with the delivery of new infrastructure, Naomi, as you've just mentioned, is something that can be done now, I believe, and, well, in fact, needs to be done as soon as possible within the time period that this strategy would cover.
Yeah. And Nicola, we heard Andy Burnham this morning talking about, the 23rd of March, properly integrating fares and ticketing to make sure that, if you use a yellow Manchester vehicle, your ticket's going to work right across the system. What do you think the various people in the process need to do to demonstrate within this sort of shorter term that this transport strategy has made a difference?
Well, there's nothing like an elected mayor to kind of
and a yellow bus.
Supercharge action. So, I know in Greater Manchester we'd already published a transport strategy before the elected mayor came in. He had his own kind of articulation of that, and the B network kind of evolved out of that. But I see the B network very much as an articulation of the vision that was in the strategy and totally consistent with it. And then identifying, right, how can we start to make this a reality as quickly as possible, which isn't always comfortable, but it does drive action. Right from small scale things you can start doing around active travel in local neighbourhoods through to, right, we need to accelerate progress towards bus franchising. Bus franchising is done right now. We need to look at rail. So I do think having that mayoral accountability, and I suppose the political cycle does help to quickly start to turn that vision into reality.
Yeah.
And I think there's lots of planning tools you can use as well. In Greater Manchester, we sort of plotted a pathway through to that vision. So we tried to make it, again, as tangible as possible. There are a series of steps we need to take around the urban form alongside the sort of transport planning interventions to make that vision come to life over the next 20 years.
Brilliant. Thank you. So there was a question, I think at the back, gentleman there, yeah.
Dear Ritual from Southwest England. Peninsula around Gateway are doing a lot of work on coaches, and I think the coach strategy within the integrated transport strategy for England is rather weak. In Europe, coaches are regulated by regulators, according to ORR. We've lost a number of rural services in the deep parts of the southwest. It's fallen outside the buses bill, and we wonder how you think that scheduled coaches, which are an important part, we're never going to put every railway line back in southwest England, or for that matter from Cambridge to Peterborough, but we'll put the main one back. We're not going to put the other back. But coach strategy as to how they fit in with trains or how they fit into networks. I mean, Newcastle upon Tyne, I set this up with the mayor up there, because I'm on the coach forum of Southwest, of Western Gateway. And I wrote to the mayor saying, well, hang on, your coach station, I turned to my wheelchair, it's all locked up, and yet your railway station's rather shiny, and Nexus is spending lots of money on your local stations. But coaches, where National Express and possibly in the future Flix depart from, are down a hill. So I wonder how you see that fitting in to the English regional transport strategies, and also, more importantly, how we fit it in England, like National Transport for Wales. And the only other thing I was going to raise is, in the buses bill, we've had a series of bus fires in South West England. You realise there's no regulatory body for buses. We've got the Rail Standard Safety Board for trains. We've got standards for carriages, light rail, for aircrafts, but we don't have a standard for buses at the moment, nor do we have an independent regulator for safety in the bus industry. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So the other issue which quite often gets left out is freight, actually. So Naomi, I'm just interested from your point of view, how do we make sure that when we're thinking about integrated transport, we're genuinely thinking about all facets of the system? So coach travel, particularly for people who can't afford rail fares for long distance travel, but also for local travel. How do we make sure we kind of take account of that and freight and all the other bits that sometimes get left out?
So I think the answer is different at different kind of scales of geography. At a sub-regional level, I absolutely think you're right. And actually, when we meet as a sub-region with the leaders of our local authorities who actually form the partnership of the STB, coaches often mentioned as an area that there is a huge amount of opportunity. One of the things that we're doing at the moment is looking at a strategic bus network, which I appreciate is just across our geography, but actually that is about how we use buses and coaches to connect more strategically across our region and then beyond. So I think the answer to that is I absolutely agree with you. On freight, again, I think the way that people look at freight is quite fragmented at different levels of geography. And as a subnational transport body, we can bridge the gap between the two. At a local level, there is the sort of the first last mile bit of freight. And then at the strategic level, there's sort of how do you connect these big freight corridors? But ultimately, between those two things, there's a lot of freight movements going through local places, and that needs to be planned really, really carefully to minimise the impact on the local community, but actually to allow us to just have a freight system that works. And so I think having those conversations at the right level of geography, for me at the moment, as we think about the economic opportunity of some of our areas, like, for example, Cambridge, where there's a huge amount of focus on the kind of future of Cambridge, I will constantly talk about not only freight servicing the economy as it grows and the innovation sector for freight and how the future of freight is quite important, but actually the construction traffic during the phase of new communities, new settlements, whatever, is really significant and a massive impact on communities. I think both of those things need to be dealt with at the specific geographies, but then at the geographical differences and then pulled together. And STBs can do a really good job on that.
Brilliant. Martin, how do you make sure in terms of sort of spatial planning we're not forgetting these kind of forms of transport movement that can sometimes get kind of forgotten? And for example, the connectivity tool, can you take account of coach availability, or is it specifically conventional public transport?
Yeah, I mean, as an example, it doesn't take coaches, and I think it's probably fair to say that coaches are maybe one of the more forgotten modes of connectivity. Obviously, there's been quite an extensive and ongoing engagement exercise as part of the Integrated National Transport Strategy, and I'll be very interested to see how much coaches has featured as part of those roadshows and that call for ideas, to see if it is something that perhaps we need to ramp up and go a bit further on.
Yeah.
But I admit, even myself, as someone in the Department for Transport, coaches isn't a massive part of what I'm familiar with, and perhaps that is a gap that we need to make sure we're fully taking advantage of.
And actually what's coming up for me is the fact that if you think about coaches in freight, they're quite similar in terms of there are large numbers of private sector operators, who have a complicated kind of regulatory environment. They're using the existing network to do their business. I'm just wondering to the extent to which, to go back to Naomi's point, it's a kind of systems issue, which is actually because they're not sort of seen as part of they're not run by the public sector, though they used to be. How do we kind of make sure that we take those interests into account? Because they're critical parts of the transport economy, aren't they? Yeah,
I wouldn't put freight in the same bucket as coaches.
Okay.
I think the department has definitely done a lot to recognise that issue on freight. There was a freight strategy published under the Future Freight Strategy under the last government. There is a multimodal coordinated freight team in the department who are now responsible for that. There is a freight council and regular engagement with industry. So we're moving in the right direction on that space. But yes, there used to be an ongoing joke in the department where you would always say "and freight" after a thing. I think we've moved on from that. But we can't stand still, especially with the challenges around decarbonisation of the network and things. I think there's a huge role for freight in the work that we do.
Brilliant. So, of course, of time, we've got a question here in the front, then lady there, and then we'll wrap it up. Gentleman down here.
You call me a gentleman?
Oh, it's Colin. No, it's just Colin. Sorry, it's just Colin. Colin, you are a gentleman in my view.
He's 5 minutes left to go.
Thank you. Colin Black. I work for a consultancy called Mayor Brown, but I also chair the Transport Development and Land Use Policy Group for Transport Planning Society, which we've been having some very fascinating conversations about some of these issues raised today on. We've been trying to deliver more sustainable and integrated transport for decades now, with very limited success, particularly in relation to our European neighbours. I'm conscious that we don't spend much time considering what goes wrong or undertaking post-mortems. We seem rarely to learn from our mistakes. So I'd like to have a little bit of fun with the panel. In this context, what does the panel think is most likely to mean that the government fails in its renewed efforts to deliver integrated transport?
Martin, I'll come to you last. You might have to think about this. Naomi, what might be an obvious point of failure in this process if we don't get it right?
Government departments operate in silos, and I don't think we should ever say that they shouldn't, because I think it's just not possible. That's their job, and so I think the failure would be if they didn't make the most of the enormous opportunity that is devolution, and by that I mean financial devolution.
Brilliant. Annie, you talked about TfL having done kind of financial planning well and less well over the years. What might be from that point of view, what might be a kind of obvious risk of failure in terms of properly integrating what we do?
No, we've been burned by this at TfL. So a failure would be doing this on a short-term basis, and by that I mean 1 to 2 to 3 year horizon. As I mentioned, 5 years feels like a really long time, but I think we do need to be more ambitious and look at a longer time frame, 10 plus years, looking at the pipeline of investment and at the pipeline of funding that it would be supporting that investment delivery. So a failure would be if we focus on the short-term wins, I suppose, and if we're back here in a number of years' time having the same conversation.
Nicola, I'm sure you'd never fail, but if you had done, in relation to integration, what would you have done wrong, and what might the government do wrong if it's not careful?
Well, I guess there's such an imperative around the housing delivery agenda at the moment. I guess the danger is that we rush into delivery without doing the proper strategic planning. And strategic planning can be painfully slow. I mean, the local transport plans take a long time to develop, but spatial plans, particularly, if you look at sort of combined authority level geography, take a very long time to develop and in the right coherent way. So I think that's the risk, is if that proper strategic planning hasn't happened, then we end up repeating maybe mistakes of the past about where we put housing and how we integrate transport with it. So I hope we take the due time and consideration to make sure we're putting housing in the right places and bringing forward the right sites.
Brilliant. So Martin, coming to you last, so what might we have done wrong if we end up failing to take this opportunity?
I mean, firstly, I think what feels different this time is that we are putting different foundations in place, hopefully, to help implement the change. I think the biggest risk really is then holding our nerve when you're under that pressure, when the development, we're saying it doesn't have enough parking, or this isn't going to work, or the network is going to chew up. Do people cave and give in, or do we hold our nerve and say, no, we believe in this? And that's going to take backing from us, from PINs, from the strategic authorities, from local councillors, and it only takes one of those dominoes to fall, I guess, before the system falls down. So for me, that's the biggest risk of failure along one of those. Yeah.
Okay, so one final question from the lady here, and we'll...
Hi, Bryony Chetwood from Travel Watch Southwest and Swindon Borough Council. So just to pick up probably on a collection of the themes you've covered here, I've got a little note to myself here saying integration of disruption. And I'm wondering what mechanisms, so Ned picked up on basically the challenge that arises when we've got a big bit of infrastructure going. My example in Swindon is Old Oak Common Works. So I know that with the infrastructure there are changes that are going to happen on the railway. And for me, that's an opportunity working on my local development plan. But looking ahead, like you say, long time scales, 10, 15 years from now, what can I do with those railway points? So how as government are you, and as the people running that network, designing the network, going to ensure we make the most out of the opportunities with this long-term strategic plan when disruption arises while implementing the other parts of our strategic plan? Are you overseeing it a bit like football match disruption and the railway lines when they have to plan in for the disaster but gain a bit of, railway works at the same time that night? What thoughts have you got? Is it being addressed? Is it an opportunity you've seen?
So it's just for clarity, do you mean sort of, how are we making the best opportunity out of a crisis sort of thing? Do you mean?
So closure of a bit of a railway line. Okay. Are you going to actually redo the points at that point as well, with on a small scale?
If you're there, let's crack on. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So Naomi, interesting question. How do we take the system is going to be disrupted if we're doing lots of new things? How are we going to make sure we kind of maximise the benefit of that disruption?
So I think there's two things. I think one is actually that this is the challenge in all of delivering this kind of level of change is it requires an enormous amount of partnership working, which is often very time consuming and the quickest thing to go when you get on with the day job. I think that one of the best things you can do to make the most of those disruptions is to have the right partnerships in place so that when something does go wrong, you say, right, okay, let's just act on this. This is what it could look like. And that actually requires really good relationships with politicians as well. And I think that's where elected mayors are exactly as you say, Nicola, really good opportunity, or elected leaders of local authorities when they're willing to stand up and say, I've made this into an opportunity. So great relationships with politicians is really important, but also knowing the right people in the sector to go, right, we've got a problem here, how are we going to move this on? And actually we spend a lot of time, particularly in the STBs, on partnership working. And often I think, do I really spend this much time on this? But actually, a really good example, we had a flooding on one of the major roads through Bedford, and the chief executive of the local authority rang me and said, can you just get the right person in National Highways to sort this out? And it was pretty quick because we knew the right people to ring. And that is a lot of relationship management over a lot of time, that then when the disruption happened, and it was quite a critical one, that one, we knew how to sort it out. We didn't take the advantage of it, but actually we have now. They've got a new flooding management system on that road, and it's happening really, it's working well. Shouldn't have flooding. That's probably the answer there.
Martin, in a sense, you're kind of involved in, I guess, quite a lot of deliberate disruption, changing the planning system, 1.5 million houses, changing the way that we make decisions. How do we make sure we sort of take maximum advantage of the fact there are going to be lots of things in motion and sort of really get the full benefits out of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an opportunity when certainly from a big infrastructure point of view. We have an infrastructure strategy in the realm, a 10-year infrastructure strategy that is cross-sector. That should help identify some of those macro opportunities for joining up and interventions. And then more on the micro scale, those more day-to-day disruptions as works happen. I'm hoping that the devolution and giving more power to locally elected will help with those relationships that Naomi talked about and make them easier to build over time, rather than trying to have to go up to a higher level and find someone who you find out who's left and blah, blah, blah. So that I think that those two things will help.
Brilliant, okay. Anna, you talked about sort of the fact that we had COVID, collapse in TfL's revenues. To what extent is it possible to use those sorts of experiences actually as opportunities to do things better next time around?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think within TfL we're doing a lot of reflection on how the COVID years were handled and what can be done better. Were we to be faced with a crisis of a similar scale in the future? And I think the key, as Naomi said, it's keeping that communication going. It's knowing who to speak to and keeping the relationships alive, which I think is key.
Yeah, it's interesting. When Peter Hendy was running the Olympics, he made sure that one of the organising bodies, TfL, the ODA or LOCOG, had drinks once a month in the run-up, just to make sure that you then knew the person, because you bet them to phone away. That thing that isn't working on the ticketing unit. It's really powerful, to your point, Naomi, about kind of those face-to-face relationships. And Nicola, finally coming to you. So, how do we kind of make creative use of disruption, destruction, perturbation?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult because often you have sort of different funding streams that have come with, particular strings attached or particular timelines. So it doesn't, again, the system doesn't necessarily make it very easy to take those opportunities. But I think if you're doing your local sort of transport planning well, and you're drawing in national agencies, for example, into that process in a really proactive way, which isn't always easy when authorities are capacity constrained and so on. But if you're doing that well, then you should have a really coherent set of integrated pipeline, I suppose, of things you want to deliver, so that when opportunities come up, you can actually say, well, we know that bit of maintenance needs to be sorted, and we need to do this thing on signalling or whatever it might be, and we can actually start to bring those different programs together or take opportunities as they arise in a more kind of responsive way. So I think there is an opportunity there through really good local transport planning, but you have to have the relationships, you have to have the capacity, and you have to be just working in a really collaborative way with a wide range of partners.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much. I'm conscious of time. We're slightly past 5 o'clock. So what did I hear? What did we hear? There's something in the air. I'm hearing there's a kind of mood, you know, to do this better going forward, given that we've tried, as Colin said, to do this several times in the past. Naomi made the point, really important to understand the systems of decision-making processes that we've used historically and how to make sure that those work better for us. This stuff is hard to do. I mean, Naomi was exhausted before we even started. You know, but actually it's genuinely difficult to integrate because of human psychology, frailty, institutional silos, all that kind of stuff. Very important thing for me about focusing on outcomes, whether they're transport outcomes, to Martin's point around mode share, or they're societal outcomes around opportunity, jobs, the climate, whatever it might be. And something for me very important about both leaning in, to use Naomi's phrase, to make stuff visibly happen quickly once the strategy's out and doesn't just become a document that gathering dust on a shelf, to show that integration has made a difference, but also thinking about these long-term goals and long-term vision. And then finally, what we've just said is really important to think about the relationships that we have across institutional boundaries with people in different sectors and different organisations, to make sure that we know how to work with them collaboratively to either pursue a common goal or deal with a common crisis. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for your questions. Sorry we didn't have time for more. Let's hope that we finally, in honour of John Prescott, who tried once, we finally get a proper integrated national transport strategy in the transport system, and society more widely gets better as a result. But thank you very much for your attendance, and have a great evening. Thanks a lot.